recording, so you're good to go whenever you're ready.
All right, we ready to get started? All right, it's 11 a.m. We're here for the regular Assembly, Enterprise, and Utility Oversight Committee of the whole meeting, scheduled from 11 to 11:30 today. We will start with going around the room for Assembly member introductions.
George Martinez.
Felix Rivera.
Anna Brawley.
Karen Bronga.
Scott Myers.
Kevin Cross. Christopher Constant.
Zach Johnson. And then from Legislative Council, we have,
Matthew Hurt.
and then from the ARL Board.
I'm Jeff Sins. I'm the vice chair of the board.
And Angie Astle, I'm chairman of the board.
All right, thanks for being here.
I'm on board as well.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, under unfinished business, item A, we have a continued discussion of Port of Alaska Plan of Finance. Is there any discussion on this item? All right, seeing none. Under item B, we have the Eklutna River Restoration Project. Any discussion? Mr. Constant.
Yeah, I have received communication from Chugach Electric. We will be scheduling a work session separate from the committee or a special committee meeting that's just going to be focused on those issues because it will tend to dominate the topic of the meeting. The time and date have yet to be determined.
All right, thank you. Anyone else? All right, under new business, we have item A, AIM 101-2023, the annual report to the Assembly from the Anchorage Regional Landfill Closure and Post-Closure Investment Fund Board. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jeff Sins. I'm here representing the ARL Closure and Post-Closure Care Investment Board. With me today, Angie Astle, and who is the chair of the board. And we prepared a presentation. We hope it's going to take about 15 to 20 minutes to go through. And then we hope we've allocated enough time for questions and answers at the end. And we understand, Mr. Chairman, that we have most of the 30 minutes scheduled for today's meeting. So first, just a little background about us. I should also mention that Ross Risvold, who's also a board member, is on the phone today. He doesn't have a part. He doesn't have a part in the presentation, but he's available to participate in the Q&A section. A little bit more about introductions. Angie Astle on my left, who is the chair of the board, is a public member, and she's been on the board since October of 2020. She's been the chair since August of 2021. Angie is Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer for Chugach Alaska Corporation, also president of the Chugach Investment Holdings, LLC. And if I can make a small announcement, Angie is now the interim CEO of Chugach Alaska as of, I think, yesterday, and expects to serve in that capacity for a period of months. I'm the vice chairman of the board. I've been on the board since February of 2019. I'm a prior chair of the board. I served in that capacity from November of 2019 to August of 2021. I'm a retired CFO and CIO from the Bristol Bay Native Corporation. In my past, I've also served as the CFO of the municipality of Anchorage for 4 years, from 2003 to 2007. And prior to that, I actually served as the first finance director of the Municipal Solid Waste Services Utility back in the 1980s. And part of my job at the time was to participate in the development of what at the time was a 20-year facilities plan, which involved the development of the what was then the new Anchorage Regional Landfill and the closure of what was then the Merrill Field landfill. So it's a strange circle of life here. I've come full circle, and I'm once again involved in solid waste services at the municipality. And then Ross, who's on the phone, was an original board member dating back to 2017. Ross has been or is the manager of the Municipal Public Finance and Investments Group, and I think has served with the municipality since shortly after the year 2000. So moving on, the purpose of today's meeting, as we understand it, is to provide an overview of the Anchorage Regional Landfill Closure and Post-Closure Fund. I'm going to present that section. And then also to provide highlights, key elements of the 2022 annual report to the Assembly. The Assembly received that report and actually accepted it as part of your consent agenda on your May 9th meeting. So this is a little bit out of sequence, but we appreciate the opportunity to meet with you in person and talk about the report. As I mentioned earlier, we're also allocated time for Q&A at the end. There are several handouts that you received. There's a hard copy of the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation. There's also a copy of that 2022 annual report. And there's copies of the relevant section of the municipal code, which is 2680, 060, and 065. Moving on. Moving on to page 5. Solid Waste Services or Solid Waste Disposal manages and operates the Anchorage Regional Landfill. That's really the single biggest activity that they're involved with. Their activities are funded almost entirely from user fees, and there are no municipal taxes allocated to funding solid waste disposal. The full cost of the ARL is including future closure and post-closure care is and must be funded during the useful life of the landfill. One of the unique aspects of closure costs is that they occur at the end of the useful life and post-useful life. And since user fees for the facility are the primary or the only source of funding, it's critical that these activities be projected, analyzed, and funded during the useful life portion of the landfill. The nature and timing of these closure costs, consist primarily of restoration of the landfill. Typically, that involves capping the site. It also includes methane gas and leachate collection and mitigation systems. The timing for these activities is partial closing is expected to begin in 2048, so about 25 years from now. Final closing is currently projected to occur in 2064, so about 41 years from now. Post-closure activities include monitoring and maintenance and operation of the site, as well as the gas and leachate collection and or mitigation systems. There's a 30-year planning period for these post-closure care activities beginning in 2064 and running through 2094. So we're looking at a period that's 41 to 71 years into the future. So the activities that we're tasked with managing funds for are well into the future. And as a result, there's a considerable amount of variability in the potential amounts. It's based on engineering forecasts. Those are expected to change. It's based on assumptions such as the life expectancy of the landfill. I mentioned that in the 1980s, I participated in a study that at the time was a 20-year long-range facilities plan for the landfill. The landfill opened in 1987, and as I mentioned, is now projected to be operational through 2064. So a little bit more than the 20 years originally anticipated. It's quite possible, given the evolution of technology as it relates to waste disposal, specifically waste to energy technology, that the landfill could have a life that extends well into the next century. So, and this is all to be determined. Under federal regulations and generally accepted accounting principles, the landfill operators are required to accrue and fund future closure, post-closure care costs during the operational useful life of the facility. And they're required to do that on a proportional basis over time. So, for example, if the landfill has been consumed, or the capacity of the landfill has been consumed, say 20% life to date as of this point in time, then the future closure, post-closure care costs would be accrued at and funded at a proportional 20% level. And as time goes on, eventually as we hit closure, these costs will be, these future costs will be fully funded. The municipal code, which is the governing or the governance structure for the fund, was updated and expanded in December of 2016. It's the two relevant sections of the code, as I mentioned, are provided as a handout today. The first section really establishes the fund and defines the basis for it, as well as the responsibilities of the various participants, and that includes the users of the landfill. It includes solid waste disposal management, and it includes this board. The code also establishes this board and defines the responsibility and authority for what we do. The purpose of the fund is to accumulate sufficient assets to during the useful life of the ARL to pay for future closure and post-closure care costs. The board first met in August of 2017. At that time, there were 3 internal members, and by internal, I mean municipal employees, 2 members from public finance and investments, and the general manager of the solid waste services utility. In February of 2019, 2 public members were added to the board. So the board now consists of 5 members. The investment policy statement that is required to be developed and approved by the board was first adopted in September of 2018, and the investment of the assets of the fund were first invested at that time. So just some information that's not in the presentation, but some numbers and timelines just for to give you a little bit of perspective about what's involved. The ARL life, as I mentioned, began in 1987 and is currently projected to run through 2064, 77-year period. Partial closure begins in 2048, which is 25 years in the future. Final closure 2064, 41 years in the future. The future care, or excuse me, the future cost of partial and full closure of the landfill is currently estimated at $226 million. Post-closure activities begin in 2064, run through 2094, so a period of 41 to 71 years into the future. Those costs are currently projected, the future value of those costs at $313 million. So the total between closure and post-closure care costs from a future cost perspective is estimated at $539 million. 25% of that amount is expected to come from user fees collected from the customers of the landfill over its useful life, and 75% of that amount is expected to be generated or to come from investment earnings generated through investments of fund assets. So just to quickly touch on the highlights, which I've touched on already, of the municipal code, AMC 268065, it documents the basis for the requirement, essentially federal regulations and generally accepted accounting principles. It defines responsibilities. The customers of the regional landfill are ultimately responsible for funding the full cost of the landfill, which includes not only operational costs and capital costs during its useful life, but closure and post-closure care costs into the future. Solid waste disposal management is responsible for budgeting and planning for future costs and for setting rates that collect the funds necessary to fund all operational costs, including closure and post-closure care. Restrictions of the fund, deposits into the fund are restricted for closure and post-closure care purposes only, and any exception to that can only be made with approval by the assembly. Okay, the second section of the code, which was the new section adopted in 2016, which is 26.80065. It formally established the ARL Closure and Post-Closure Care Investment Fund, defined the purpose of the fund as to accumulate, manage, safeguard monies of solid waste services disposal that are to be used to pay closure and post-closure care costs. It established the board to manage all investment activities of the fund. And it defined an investment objective of the fund, which is to achieve long-term return on investments, which in conjunction with annual deposits from solid waste disposal will be sufficient to satisfy the ARL closure post-closure liability. The board has the authority in executing its task to engage the services of outside experts. This would be advisors, managers, and such. The board has responsibility to monitor and ensure timely deposit of funds collected by solid waste service disposal for this purpose. And there's an annual deposit from solid waste disposal that occurs not later than June 30th of each year. The board also is tasked with engaging an independent analyst and or company to perform an estimate of the closure and post-closure care liability at least once every 10 years. And this was last performed in 2020. HDR was the consulting firm that was engaged to prepare the estimate of the present value of future closure and post-closure care costs. This will be updated again sometime prior to the year 2030. Also, the board is tasked with submitting an annual report to the assembly, and we're going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about the report that was delivered to the assembly for calendar 2022, and it was accepted by the assembly on May 9th. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angie, who's going to review that report with you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I have a few more slides that'll go over the information contained in the annual report, as Jeff just said, that was submitted to the municipal assembly. So the investment policy that Jeff referred to was adopted in 2018, and it was developed based on this extremely long-term horizon to meet the goals of the fund, satisfying the closure and post-closure liability anticipated to start in 2048, and as Jeff mentioned, run through 2064 and into the next 30 years, which was 2094. The investment policy was approved with the assistance and recommendations of Callan, who is the fund's investment consultant, and was based on these investment objectives. The asset allocation in the investment policy was 30% equity, 20% non-US equity, and 50% fixed income. The public finance and investment staff rebalance this fund quarterly to make sure it stays in compliance with this asset allocation. The capital market forecast developed by Callan at the time of the adoption reflected a median return expectation of 5.5%. This is a 10-year market outlook, but as we've already talked about, the fund itself has an extremely longer time frame than a 10-year time frame. The standard deviation that's listed there is a measure of volatility, and it reflects how much the returns can move above and below the median return expectations. So based on this standard deviation, we do expect that the fund will have short-term volatility. However, the very long-term nature of this fund is expected to reflect the annualized rate of return around those median expectations. If we turn to the next slide, we're going to talk about how we executed that investment policy strategy. The funds initially selected to achieve the exposure to the asset allocation were based on the investment objectives of managing the assets of the fund in a cost-effective manner while earning a competitive rate of return. The funds are passive index funds and have a single asset manager for each asset class. So pretty simple. The ARL fund holds a small equity position in these funds. In 2022, the board with Callan undertook a review and an education of the fixed asset income strategy, which comprises the majority of the portfolio at 50%. And we concluded that moving from a passively managed fund to an actively managed fund increased the return while improving the risk and return characteristics of the fund. As the fixed income position is so large, 50% of the portfolio, the board approved this move in November 2022 to move from a passively managed core index fund to an actively managed core plus fund. This allows for the active manager of the fund to invest up to 20% in high yield and non-US. And again, increases the return expectations and improves the return and the risk characteristics. This change was implemented in the first quarter of 2023. The next slide reflects the portfolio balance for 2022, which was down 15%. And the fund value at the end of the year was $16,893,292. This included the $500,898 that was contributed, the annual contribution from solid waste, and the rest was an unrealized loss. We included the prior year returns down below so that you can see the volatility that we talked about a little bit ago. This is expected in this portfolio, and that this portfolio is acting exactly as we expected it to. This extreme long-term nature of the fund allows the fund to be invested and weather these short-term volatilities, both up and down, and achieve the long-term fund growth goal of 5.5%. Sorry, where am I? So I wanted to talk a little bit about the macroeconomic environment. Undoubtedly, 2022 was a very challenging year with both equities and bonds down together substantially. The US bond market had its worst year ever. And as noted in previous slides that we just looked at, it followed 3 years of strong performance from 2021 of 9.4%, 2020, which is up 12.5%, and 2019, which was up 17.3%. This just highlights the volatility of the market. We experienced a broad market decline in 2022 as the Fed engaged in their aggressive rate hikes to combat inflation. Global stock and bond markets both posted double-digit losses for the year. Although too early to tell on what 2023 will look like, we're only in June, but we are seeing for the first half of the year signs of improvement, with inflation moderating, the Fed slowing their tightening cycle, and improved performance for the first half of 2023. As of June 13th, 2023, the ARL Investment Fund was up to $18,054,119. This portfolio return year to date is nearly 7% or 6.8%. The AR closure and post-closure liability, accrued liability, present value at December 2022 is 39.8 million. And the assets on hand at the end of 2022 valued at 16.9 million. That may look like a disconnect. However, the return expectations, the difference between the assumed inflation rate of 3.5% and the growth rate of 5.5% is 2%. And that delta is anticipated to result in the value over the length of the time, making up that difference and achieving the long-term goal of funding the closure and post-closure liabilities between the period of 2064 and 2094. And my last slide is that the 2023 contributions anticipated is 535,408. And this comes from a very complex model that Jeff referred to earlier in his presentation that incorporates many long-term financial planning factors, and it's called the Raft-Tellis model. This Raft-Tellis model, as we get closer over the next 40 years, will continue to be updated as we get closer and clearer pictures on what the future holds. And we can make adjustments along the way to ensure that the ARL fund achieves its ultimate goal of satisfying all the closure and post-closure liabilities throughout this long life of the fund.
All right, thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and in the queue I have Mr. Constant.
Mr. Thurn, could you come up quick?
Ms. Bronco, or Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, I just had a quick question while Alden's coming up. First, I appreciate the overview of the investment, and my very limited understanding is that 2022 was not great for everybody, so that's helpful. And I guess just to frame it, it sounds like this is a retirement fund for the landfill, essentially. So we are looking at a long-term time frame for those of us who are looking at the negative double digits. But my quick question was, you mentioned technology generally over time historically has extended the lifespan of a landfill. Is there known risk that that time span would be shortened in any way? Like, does it go backwards or has it in other places?
The only cause that is likely to shorten the life of the landfill would be waste generation higher than the projected levels. And the way the model typically works is that waste generation is a function of population. And it's based on assumed population growth or a range of assumed population growth for the municipality and a waste generation per capita assumption and a range for that as well. So it is possible that it could be shortened. History would tell us in the case of the Anchorage Regional Landfill that it's unlikely and that it's much more likely that the life will be extended before we get to 2064.
Anyone else?
Yep, I am hoping to speak with Mr. Thurn. Alden, we are having a work session coming up soon on the creation of a fiduciary board of trustees to oversee and manage the MOA trust and related investments. And so the timing is very interesting. The question I have, and maybe it's a question to answer later, is there a role for us to be contemplating alignment of the various trust and investment boards underneath the broader board? And how should we be thinking about that board and its relationship to the broader municipal investment pools?
Through the chair, Mr. Constant, I think that both of those investment committees are, and this one and that one, are completely different in what they're trying to accomplish. With the one that we're going to be having the conversation on here in a few minutes, I mean, that is actual money that we're having right now that we're trying to invest and deal with market fluctuations, as well as provide the annual dividend back to the municipality of Anchorage. I think the decision-making and the thought process and what we're trying to do and what we're trying to cover for them and how the general fund affects that, I think makes it vastly different than this particular fund that we're talking about here. And that's why I actually wanted to sit in here and I've heard about this for quite some time. With the projections in the future and so many things that can happen, I see no value of putting them together and trying to manage them under one board, because they really have completely different types of strategies and goals and a lot more future projections in this particular one in time frame.
So I also know that we have the Police and Fire Retirements Board. We have a number of investment pools. And so I think at some point we should probably look at them as a whole, kind of see what they are, how they play with each other, and if there is the need for some shared oversight or not, because we're speaking the same language with different goals, but ultimately speaking, it's all in the wheelhouse of trying to grow investments one way or the other. So, okay, but the answer in the short term is probably not, but we can talk more about that.
And I would suggest that's a very good question for our outgoing treasurer as well. I mean, who's been running the investment board of the municipality for decades, and has actually decided, try to push everybody towards a board type environment to begin with. So I think he'd probably have a very good perspective on that. I would just say that they're vastly different types of what they're trying to accomplish and so forth. And this one here is very, very specialized. And I've either worked for or with both of these people here, whether they know it or not, in the past. And they are two of the brightest financial minds that we've had in the state for, unfortunately, decades. But I would be very careful in trying to combine this type of board with some of the other ones, although they all have different investment type guidelines and projections and what they're trying to accomplish.
And I think, we have a duty of oversight over all of these, but I don't think we see them as in perspective. So there's something there. I'll talk to Mr. Moore about it. Thank you.
Ms. Bronga, and then Mr. Cross.
Mr. Cross was actually next.
Ms. Cross, and then Ms. Bronga.
So by 2063, 64, to retire Anchorage Regional Landfill, how much capital do we need? What was the estimated? I know you said it and I just failed to write it down. 500 million?
The current projection for the future cost of closure activities, which run, partial close starts in 2048 and runs through 2064, is 226 million.
All right, 226 for the 2 million. And I'm just doing some math here, 226. And I'm just trying to understand this fund because I'm using a compound interest calculator. So I'm trying to determine your assets on hand. If we just looked at our assets on hand of 16 million, if we got a conservative 4% return over that 40-year period, compound interest with contributions of $45,000 a month, which is a little over 500 divided by 12, we could be at 370 million by that time. So that would just be at but is a 4% interest rate a conservative rate or an aggressive rate, depending on a 40-year average? So I'm just trying to figure out where that sits in the fund. The other thing I'm thinking about is that one of the things that we've dealt with is I can always consider the landfill kind of be like a utility, although it's not, more of a service. And if there's ever been discussions, and I see that in your bond portfolio, in your portfolio, you're looking at bonds on a national level. But one of the things we've desperately needed is a utility bank for expansion of bonds and expansion of utilities, particularly water and sewer throughout all of Anchorage and up into Eagle River. And whether or not there isn't some sort of agreement with AWW to create those bonding program where we can go in, assess those lots for a 25, 30-year period. You're getting an interest back. We're building infrastructure here locally, something we desperately need to get housing costs under control. We're getting a above average interest rate on our money. We're getting at a bond rate, but reinvesting in our communities. And if there's been any communications or any consideration as far as utilizing those assets that we currently have through the ARL strategic savings account for utility expansion.
As of this point in time, no. The fund and the board is relatively new, created through assembly action in 2016. It's been operational since 2018. Given the long-term life and the really conservative nature of the investment program as it exists today, it's in its early stages, and there's been no discussion of anything like that. That doesn't rule it out in the future, just means to date, there's been no such discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to have that discussion. I know that that's come up multiple times at not just the housing meetings that we've had, but ACDA board meetings with conversations with AWW about how do we create a utility bank that allows us to go out and bond so that we can get infrastructure throughout Anchorage, whether that's upgrades, and then special assessments or regional assessments to the properties that benefits that are paid back over a 25 or 30-year period. And so I think there's a way to get strong, stable, consistent investment that's also here locally that helps with some of the issues that we have. And so I'd like to carry that conversation further. Thank you so much.
All right, Ms. Brongan, then I think we'll have to move on because we're already about to run into the time for our next meeting.
So I'm kind of late to the party, but with the 226 million cost of closure, 313 million post-closure, where does the money come for the new landfill? Is that in the closure fees, or that's another separate pool of money? And what's the estimate on what the new landfill would cost?
So if by new landfill, you mean the next landfill after ARL, that's not factored into what this is about. This is about closing and post-closure costs specifically related to the ARL.
If I might, the real work is seeing what ways we can extend the life of the landfill, which gets to those more subjective conversations about waste to energy and other methodologies that might actually create a permanent solution. So we don't just fill up the land with waste and then have to move to another site. It's a very difficult problem.
Then it made me think of the next question is like best practices for the environment, stretching out the length of this landfill also reduces your income of people dumping. It's kind of a catch-22. If you try to keep less things from going in the landfill, then you're also less user fees, which hurts this investment. I don't know, it's making my head hurt.
But you're extending the life.
Yeah, you're extending the life and this is to fund future costs. You push those future costs off, which means because there's a compounding and an investment of those funds, you don't need as much today to pay for those future costs because the investment grows at a faster rate than the liability, which is the key to how this works.
All right, thank you. Does anybody have any items under new business? Under committee legislative and budget priorities and other standing items, I have the SWU update, legislative priorities for state legislative program, and budget items for 2024. Does anybody have anything to discuss under there? No? Anyone here for audience participation? Nobody on the phones? All right. Guess if there's nothing else, then I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you.
All right, we're adjourned.